Before you sit, I'd like to say just a little prayer. And it comes from, actually, a person named Nina Simone, who I grew up, well, I didn't grow up, I live in her hometown in Tryon. You might recognize these words because they were made famous by a rock group in the 1960s. The prayer goes like this: I'm just a soul whose intentions are good. Dear Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood. Please be seated. I love it. And I love Rob and Sandra, and I so appreciate the invitation to come and be with you this morning. Our friendship goes back quite a few years. I would say to the late 1980s, perhaps, into the 1990s. We went to St. Margaret's together, which was a church founded on mission. Our first 3 offerings were given away. I thought at the time that was pretty silly, kind of a stupid thing. I wasn't a businessman, but I knew that if we gave all our money away, we couldn't pay our bills. Well, we ended up doing that and more. It was the smartest, wisest thing we ever did. So we went to St. Margaret's, and in the context of that, we got to spend 1 year in seminary together. And Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, y'all went 2 years ahead of us.
Correct, yeah.
So we got to spend your senior year and our first year there together, and thank you for that because it really helped us get acclimated and it made a kind of a stressful event tolerable. But one thing I thought I heard you say was that was my idea, that we went to seminary.
It was God's.
You think it was God's? I thought I misunderstood you.
Yeah. Bruce, God, Bruce Almighty.
There you go. Well, if it was my idea, y'all can thank me later. Well, last time I was here, probably one of the only times I've been here with y'all, Rob preached a fantastic sermon, and he mentioned someone we knew, a man named Carney Norris. And Carney was like all-world football player at Spartanburg High School, as most of you might know. Or if you listen to his sermon. But my understanding was that, well, I know Carney, he was like a Mack truck. If you were standing in front of him on the football field, it was all over. And what this is another question for you, Rob. Did I misunderstand that you played against him on defense?
No.
Oh, okay.
In a little scrimmage in PE class.
Oh! Oh!
Coach Thompson said, hey, Rob, see if you can stop Carney. The answer was no.
No, okay. Well, once again, if that had been so, I would have told you not to do that. Yeah. So I wouldn't have planted that idea because I knew that would have been bad. Because anybody who got in front of him ended up dazed and confused. And to kind of bring us back to a little bit of seriousness here, I think that's where we are these days as a nation. At least that's what I'm feeling these days, a little bit dazed and confused by all the events of the world and what's going on these days. These days are not particularly going well, you might say. Some say they're the worst of times, and I would agree with them, especially for those people in California, in Dayton, Ohio, and all those who are affected in El Paso, Texas. I think we're all appalled by what's happening in those places and in our world, New Zealand, it seems like everywhere. And I would say that for these folks, it probably is the worst of times. I couldn't think of anything worse. I would like to think, though, that go back a little bit. I grew up in Spartanburg, went to Spartanburg High School, as I said, and I grew up in this town. And I may be sounding a little bit naive, but I would like to think that in those days growing up in this town, that tragedies like that just didn't occur. They were unheard of. Well, as I started to reflect on this, not so much, because I remember in grammar school, I remember coming home and turning on the television set and seeing that our president, John Kennedy, had been shot in Dallas. And that was a very formative moment for me. I was like, okay, maybe you didn't agree with his policies, but you don't do that, do you? We don't do that. And then later, Martin Luther King was assassinated, shot in Memphis. I recall not really knowing what that was about, not fully understanding. I was just a youth growing up in town, trying to figure out things. And even if you disagreed with his policies or his mission or what he was about, you don't do that, do you? I remember really not knowing what that was all about, and I wondered how it would all turn out. And I remember being in college in the 1970s, early, and something called Kent State happened, where there were people who died at the hands of our own National Guard, I believe. There were people, you don't do that. It doesn't happen here, does it? There were conflicts at home, people protesting a war in Vietnam. And I had friends who were going and friends who were coming home and some not coming home. And I remember being in that last group of people who were to be drafted. And I remember looking at the numbers, and I had a cousin who was like number 6. Well, he was gone. He went to join and did 3 years in the Navy in the Mediterranean rather than serve 1 in Vietnam. He'd served, though. There are other people who had to go who made other choices. You know, I remember my number was 283. I was off to college. I was one of the fortunate ones, I guess. But all these things, all these events, and all these circumstances were causes for bewilderment for me, causes for frustration among many people, and I would say confusion at best. So these are just some of the thoughts I had growing up in the 60s and 70s here in Spartanburg, and also thinking about, what is happening today. One way I think, dare I say, my generation, our generation got through this was through music. My mother asked me one time, she loved poetry, she was lamenting that where are all the good poets these days? And I said, Mom, they're the musicians, they're the musical artists. Listen to the lyrics. I mean, they're unbelievable. That's where they're residing these days. Indeed, it was true. And music helped us a lot get through these, helped us understand what was happening around us, because there are a good many people who, through their music, were helping us form our hearts and minds around things that were right and things that were wrong, I think. So I was kind of caught in the middle growing up with music, though. So to step back a minute, my brother and 2 sisters, they were older than me, and they grew up listening to Motown. And so I listened to Motown, and I knew everything from Garnet Mims and the Enchanters to the Four Tops. And I remember going to clubs here in town, and what was accessible to us was the Tams, if we were lucky, the Platters, and one of my favorites was Maurice Williams and the Zodiacs. But that's what I listened to. But my friends, they listened to things like Led Zeppelin, Cream, The Who. And I remember a friend calling me over to his house one time. I got this new album. You got to come over and listen to it. And I went over there and listened to it, and I was like, whoa, that's Jimi Hendrix. So I was caught up in 2 worlds, you might say. I guess, some might say, here I was, preppy white boy trying to be a hippie wannabe. You can live in 2 worlds. I've done it. We all are doing it now. There's one artist I want to talk about who had very broad appeal among all sorts of people. And I'm going to read a little bit about him. I didn't know this, but at the age of 14 or 15, an artist named Jerry Butler invited him to come in and be a part of a group called the Roosters. This man was named Curtis Mayfield. And he became the lead singer of what became the Impressions. And he became, as you know, famous in his own right as a solo artist. Well, to get to the point, one of his most memorable songs, and one I'd like for you to, just as I'm going to give you the lyrics, just be kind of playing it in your head, and you know the music. It goes like this, and it was like right in the middle of the 1960s when this came out, and actually it became an anthem for the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King said, "This is where we are." As people get ready, it goes, "There's a train a-coming. You don't need no baggage. You just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the diesels humming. Don't need no ticket. You just thank the Lord." You know, as I say, those were turbulent times in a different kind of way. It was a very turbulent time that we grew up in. And people like Curtis, Martin, were calling people to a higher purpose. They were calling people to a better country, I think a heavenly one. And the chaos of those days in the 60s left our nation in much confusion. Another group, I think the Temptations, called it a ball of confusion. There were many reasons, you see, for us to be afraid and confused during those years. But Mayfield, like many others, understood that something greater was on the horizon, that there was still something good left in us, and so we needed to dig deep and attain that. So there's a deep spiritual truth, I think, in what these men were saying, a truth that's, I think, very positive and life-giving. So, we live in this world, dazed and confused, angered. I think if you haven't been a little angry lately, maybe you haven't been paying attention. I don't know. I'm not going to judge that. But I know people are afraid. I mean, it was reported recently, I think just this week in Times Square, a motorcycle backfired or a car backfired or something that sent people scattering, running for cover because they thought it was a gunshot. I heard that the youth now have the opportunity to have bulletproof backpacks to take to school. We don't have to live in fear, or do we? Perhaps there's a better way. I want to pause here. Let me get a sip of water. There's a story I want to share with you about a young girl who she lived near a cemetery, a graveyard, and she and her little friends each morning would gather together on the way to school, to go on the way to school. And when they got to the graveyard, something kind of peculiar happened. Her friends would split off and go around the graveyard. You see, their homes were on one side and their school was on the other side of the graveyard. Well, her friends would part company there, and they would go around, but this little girl, she walked straight through like nobody's business. Well, this repeated itself day in and day out. And there was a man who lived near the graveyard, and he watched all this happen day after day, evening, afternoon after afternoon. He'd watch the little girls part company, and he'd see this one little girl in the evening come back to the graveyard. So one afternoon, he couldn't stand any longer, and he called the little girl over, and he said, "Honey, I see each day you and your friends part company at the entrance to the graveyard. They go around this way, and you walk straight through. I suspect that they are afraid to walk through, but I see that perhaps you are not. Can you tell me what this is about?" And she said, "Sir, I'm not afraid because I know that I'm just passing through. I'm just passing through. We're just passing through." I think this speaks about keeping an appropriate perspective on life and about life. We're all just passing through this world, on our way to a better country, a heavenly one. And we can choose to live our lives in fear in this world, or we can choose to face our fears head on and not let them deter us from what we're about, who we are, or where we're going. We can't let our fears stop us from doing what is just and noble and true. And we can ready ourselves by being honest about our feelings. And if we're honest about our feelings, then we can use them as a springboard to positive change. We can honor the memory of people like John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and dare I say, the martyrs of hatred and violence that are being so often killed these days. Dr. King and others, these martyrs I speak of, faced the worst in life. And they made the choice to engage it fearlessly. Fearlessly. This is how we're to get ready. We're to prepare ourselves simply by being clear that this is what we're hoping for. We're to prepare ourselves by being clear about which train we want to get on, about which train we wish to board. Jesus first, above all else, above all other opportunities, above all other choice. We choose Jesus as our conductor. We choose love. And we make a choice not to hate. We make a choice not to be afraid, especially not to be afraid to act. And we do it now. We do it today, not simply at the second coming. Now, I want to say a word about second coming. You know, we pray for this each Sunday in our Eucharistic prayer. We say he's died, he's risen, he'll come again. I want to leave you with just this thought. The second coming is not something that is only a future event. I contend that it happens every time we face our fears. I contend that the second coming happens every time we stand up to what is evil in this world. Anytime, every time we ask God in Christ to enter our hearts, every time we work to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God, Jesus comes to us and we are in the midst of a second coming. Perhaps you're in the midst of a third, or fourth, or fifth, or 10th, or 100th. In essence, what I'm saying is that there can be as many second comings as you choose. Just as many times as you are willing to ask Jesus to stand beside you, to walk with you, to live with you, to enter into your heart, just as many times as you choose. It will be so. So I want to say it's less about predicting a date. To cut to it. It's less about predicting a date. It's more about learning how to live in the eternal, or with an eternal perspective in the here and now. Okay. A word about the gospel. In the gospel, Jesus is asking his followers to adopt a certain way of life. He's asking them to adopt a way of life that's not rooted in the securities of this world, Rather, they are to seek security from the heavenly world, the eternal world. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to rehash the gospel stories of the young man concerned about his inheritance or the man who felt a need to build larger barns. You know those stories. Suffice it to say that their priorities were out of whack. Okay, they're out of sync with what is truly valuable in life. So in a nutshell, this is the message. This is the message that Jesus is giving to his disciples at that moment in time. I think it's the message Jesus is giving to us, also his disciples. We are to be ready. We are not to be afraid. There is one coming. This is the promise. There is one coming who will put an end to all the hatred, to all the war, and to all the strife. We only need to do our part. The train is coming. The train is coming. One day, Jesus will return, and we must be ready. So let's prepare ourselves this day. And in so doing, make the path straight for those who are to follow. Think, sing, meditate, say the words with me if you know them. People, get ready. There's a train a-coming. You don't need no baggage. You just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the diesels humming. You don't need no ticket. You just thank the Lord. Amen.